When the last train carried the young men away, the town did not empty all at once. It happened slowly, over the autumn of 1917. A son here, a husband there, the blacksmith's boy, the banker's two sons, the men who hauled the grain and tended the stock and ran the small businesses that kept a remote prairie town alive. One by one, they put on uniforms and boarded the eastbound train, and one by one, the things they had done went undone. And when the dust of that last train settled, a young woman stood at the center of a town that had lost nearly all of its working-age men, and somehow, the holding of it together fell to her. She was the schoolteacher. She was barely past 20, and before it was over, she would run that town through a war and a plague with her own two hands. This is the story of a woman history never wrote down, who became, when everyone else was gone, the last thing standing between her town and ruin. We're going to call her Ada. The name is our own. But the empty town was real, and the war, and the sickness, and the women who held it all together when the men were gone. Those belonged to 1,000 towns across this country in those years. To understand how a school teacher came to run a town, you have to understand what a school teacher was on the frontier. She was not only the woman who taught the children their letters. In a small prairie town, the schoolhouse was very often the only public building there was. And so it was everything at once. It was the church on Sunday, the meeting hall on election day, the place where the town gathered to marry and to mourn. And the teacher, usually a single young woman barely older than her oldest pupils, was one of the most trusted and central people in the whole community. She was educated when many were not. She kept the town's children. When something needed organizing, she was who people turned to. Ada was all of that already, on the ordinary day before the war came. What the war did was take everyone else away and leave her there. Because in 1917, the United States entered the Great War, and the draft began calling up the young men. First, those 21 to 30, and later, those as young as 18 and as old as 45. In the cities, the loss was absorbed. But in a small farming town, where every able-bodied man had a job that fed people, the loss was a kind of amputation. The fields still had to be harvested. The animals still had to be fed. And the men who had done it were in a training camp, and then on a ship, and then in the trenches of France. So the women did it. This is the part of the war that history has almost entirely forgotten. The women who picked up everything the men set down. Across more than 30 states, tens of thousands of women went into the fields as farm laborers. They called them the farmerettes and the Woman's Land Army, and they brought in the harvest that fed the army and a starving Europe. And in town after town, the women ran the rest of it. They organized the bond drives that paid for the war. They built the Red Cross chapters that rolled the bandages and knitted the socks. And they led the great campaign to conserve food. For the slogan of those years was that food would win the war, teaching one another to can and preserve every scrap the gardens and orchards gave, to go without wheat and meat and sugar so it could be shipped to the front. And there was real skill in it, the kind we have mostly handed off to factories and forgotten. The women held canning lessons and taught the techniques to any neighbor who did not know them. How to put up vegetables and fruit in sealed jars so they would keep through winter. How to dry and store a garden's worth of food. How to stretch a sack of flour on the wheatless days. How to make a meal without meat and never waste a thing. It was patriotism and survival braided together. And the woman teaching most of it in Ada's town was the same one teaching the children. She was the one who pulled all of that together, who turned a leaderless place when its leaders were gone into something that functioned. She kept her school open for the children left behind, and then she organized everything else besides. It was hard and it was relentless, but it was survivable. The town was thinner and wearier and frightened for its boys overseas, but it was holding. And then, in the autumn of 1918, something arrived that the bond drives and the canning could not hold back. The sickness came. It was the great influenza of 1918, the deadliest plague the modern world had seen, and it did not behave like ordinary sickness. It did not take only the old and the weak. It struck down the strongest, young men and young women in the prime of their lives, and it could take them with terrifying speed, a person healthy at breakfast and gravely ill by night. It moved through crowded places, so the towns shut their schools and their churches and their meeting halls. And here was the cruelty hidden inside the timing. The doctors and the nurses who might have fought it were gone. They were in the army camps and the field hospitals of France. When desperate towns sent word begging for help, the answer that came back was that they could have all the doctors they wanted, but not a single nurse. In a small, remote town like Ada's, there might be no doctor within reach at all. Whole families fell ill together, every one of them, with no one left on their feet to so much as carry them water. And so, Ada made a decision that would define her. She took the schoolhouse, the heart of the town, the place where she had taught its children their letters, and she turned it into a hospital. And she became the nurse the town did not have. She was not trained for it. Almost no one was. But she had something nearly as valuable. She knew the old, plain knowledge of how to care for the gravely sick. And she had the will to do it without stopping. Because here's the truth of that plague that is worth remembering. There was no cure and no medicine that could touch it. What saved lives was nursing. Steady, attentive, around-the-clock care was by every account the single greatest difference between the people who lived and the people who died. And so Ada did the unglamorous, exhausting work that actually mattered. She kept the sick warm and let them rest, because the body needed every ounce of its strength to fight. She got water and broth into them, spooning it past their lips when they were too weak to lift a cup themselves, because the dehydration could kill as surely as the fever. She brought the burning fevers down with cool, wet cloths. She kept the windows open for fresh air, as they believed then it should be, and she kept the sick apart from the well wherever she could manage it. She changed and boiled the linens and scrubbed her hands raw, fighting the secondary infections that carried so many off. And above all, she watched. Because with this sickness, the turn could come in an instant, and a person at the bedside who noticed in time, who acted, could pull someone back from the edge. She went with almost no sleep, from cot to cot, in a schoolroom that smelled of sickness, for weeks. It was the hardest thing she would ever do. Not everyone could be saved. No one in those weeks could save everyone, and she carried the ones she lost for the rest of her life. But many lived who would not have lived without her. In a town with no doctor and no nurse and no medicine, a young schoolteacher with a few cool cloths, a pot of broth, clean linen, and an iron refusal to quit was the only thing standing between her neighbors and the grave. And she stood there. And then, as these things do, it passed. The fever burned through the town and moved on. The war ended that same November, and in the months that followed, the young men who had survived began to come home, to a town that was still there, still standing, still a community, because someone had refused to let it fall apart while they were gone. They came back to find that the schoolteacher had kept their children taught, their harvests in, their sick alive, and their town whole, through 2 years that should by every right have broken it. History did not write her name down. History remembers the generals and the presidents and the great battles overseas. It does not remember the young woman in the prairie town who ran the whole place when every man was gone, who fed it and organized it and nursed it through a plague with her own hands and asked for nothing in return. There were thousands of her in thousands of towns, and we have forgotten nearly all of them. We have forgotten too the things she knew, how to keep a community alive without the doctor, the store, the institutions we now lean on, with nothing but knowledge and nerve and the will to stand when others could not. So this is for her, the schoolteacher who held the whole town together when there was no one else to do it. If her story moved you, then she is not forgotten anymore. Stay with us, and we will keep bringing the forgotten back into the light.